Hello and welcome, everyone. Today's guest is Erich Schwartzel. He is a journalist who has reported on the film industry for the Wall Street Journal since 2013, and he is the author of book Red Carpet, Hollywood, China, and the Global Battle for Cultural Supremacy. His first book and a fascinating topic that we'll talk about today. Welcome to Wider Angle.
Hey, thank you for having me.
It is a fascinating topic written in a very accessible way, both for international relations nerds and general audience. So kudos to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I mean, I thought when I was setting out to do it that there were obviously all these broad, big, often nebulous themes to explore, like soft power and the geopolitical space. But I also thought this is about the movies, and in some cases, this is about very silly movies. So it should also
Mm.
be a story that is also very serious and consequential, but also fun and deeply weird.
Oh, yeah. So, okay, let's dive in. To start, can you please tell us a little bit more about the impetus for the book? I mean, you describe in the introduction how you came to the idea of writing it after you moved to LA and joining the Bureau of Wall Street Journal. And you write how you soon started seeing China everywhere. How
That's
so?
right. I mean, I joined the journal in 2013, and in retrospect, it was really the perfect time because that was when the Hollywood-China relationship had really entered its silly season. I
Mm.
mean, there were a lot of deals flowing, there was a lot of money coming in, and there were a lot of studios doing really, quite frankly, hilarious things to try and appeal to this new market. It was
Hmm.
2013, the box office in China was growing, the box
Hmm.
office in the US was not. And so there was suddenly
Hmm.
this sense that you really should try and market your movies and make your movies for China. So you started to see all of these examples like Transformers would cast Chinese actresses in bit roles, and scripts would be changed so that Chinese censors would approve certain films. Um, and it seemed like on one hand, it was an example of kind of like what they call dumb money flowing into the country and flowing into Hollywood. But it seemed also like this was a sign of China's real ambitions. And that's what I started to focus on. And then around 2016, with the election of Donald Trump, there was this massive shift where suddenly everything that China was doing seemed to be in contrast to what was happening in the US, especially when it came to how it might be able to export its mode of governance to other countries around the world. And I started to think, well, how can culture play a role in that?
We learned from your book that by 2019, then, as you write, Hollywood was just so fully absorbed, you say, Beijing's political preferences that even without Chinese actually doing anything, they were making decisions based on that. And
Right.
so I'm curious, can you tell us a little bit more about these different phases? You speak about three different phases of how we actually got there, right?
Right, exactly. I started to see it as a sort of a relationship in three acts.
Mm.
And starting in the 90s, there was an early courtship where a lot of the early days into China were defined not necessarily by any real revenue opportunities, because this is kind of hard to wrap your mind around. But China, despite having this massive population, is drastically underscreened. It really doesn't have as
Mm.
many movie theaters as its population could support. And so when movies from America started flowing into the country in 1994, it was really just like a bit of an afterthought to a lot of the studios. That started to change around 2008, 2009 with the mass urbanization of China and the construction of tons of movie theaters. And so suddenly you had a massive growth market. Now, you kind of alluded to this, but one of the real considerations that you have to have in China that you don't have in other foreign markets is censorship. Every movie that is being shown in China is screened for Communist Party officials who watch for anything that they might deem offensive or anti-Chinese or problematic in any way. And so, as American studios grew more and more vested in accessing the Chinese market, they started to care more and more about what those censors might
Mm.
have an issue with. And it doesn't take really a lot of experience to start to absorb what those rules are. Now, in some cases, Chinese authorities will just publish the rules and they'll say you're not allowed to show ghosts or masturbation or
Mhm.
anything that's critical of the Communist Party, right? But then other times it's just really a trial and error where you submit a movie maybe sometimes 2 or 3 times and you see what changes you have to make in order for the censors to finally approve it. I would say that was the second phase when you had a lot of censorship concerns, but also just a lot of excitement over the money that was going to be able
Mhm.
to be accessed in the Chinese market. And now I think we're in the third phase, which, if we're going to continue the relationship metaphor, is the divorce, because China's film industry has grown at quite a clip.
Mm.
And as Chinese officials have done in other industries, there's been this concerted effort to nationalize that industry and create less reliance on the foreign influence. So
Mhm.
right now, China's box office is seeing routinely massive blockbusters released in theaters. The key difference being they're now Chinese blockbusters rather than
Mhm.
American blockbusters.
And actually it was really interesting to read different details or the ways that filmmakers used for forging a cultural identity for different countries throughout history. And you mentioned even, in Europe, how Italy did it, how France did it, in the US, and then how also China has been doing it throughout different decades. And so while reading your book, your readers, and while I was reading it, I mean, we could learn a lot of history about the fact that, for example, in the US, we have a lot of films that have been successful precisely because actually they address political sensitivities.
Mm.
And that was something that the audiences loved and the conversation that it sparked. But that is not the case in China, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you think about it, like, you're right. I mean, in America and in a lot of the West, we're accustomed to movies pushing the envelope and actually being praised for pushing the envelope.
Mm-hmm.
This wasn't always the case. Certainly in the 1930s and 40s, Hollywood had its own kind of censorship and its own kind of often very religiously influenced guidelines as to what could be shown on screen. But starting in the 60s, we started to see this real effort to use film to push boundaries. And I
Mm-hmm.
mean, how many movies do we go see, good or bad, that have the government is the bad guy, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's a massive conspiracy and so on. That is never going to be the case in China, because every movie that is made there has to have its script and the final production approved by the Ministry of Propaganda before it can be shown. So when you go to the movies in China, there's this kind of surreal thing that happens where you sit down, and when the screen lights up, this green screen comes on with a dragon on it that is the seal of the Ministry of Propaganda, and there's this kind of trumpet blast, and it's kind of just saying this movie has been approved for your viewing by your government. But it's also a bit of a reminder that everything that is shown on screen in China these days is some kind of endorsement from the
Mm-hmm.
government, whether it's just in not showing anything that would draw offense, or what we would consider outright propaganda, which might be, a movie about Mao Zedong, or a movie about the Chinese army, or a movie about the Chinese Olympians. There are like there's like a bit of a spectrum there, right?
Mm-hmm.
That we really, I think, in America, frankly, take for granted. I mean, there are examples that people will be quick to point to of American movies that veer into the propagandistic, right? Like, I think
Mm-hmm.
the new Top Gun might be the example that's top of mind. But I would argue, though, it's an entirely different system in a country where all art is expected to serve the state in some capacity.
Mm. Yeah, you mentioned it at several instances. The description, I want to ask you to kind of clarify that relationship between art and the state in China. And when it comes to films, you're right, and tell us that Mao banned American movies in 1950 and nationalized the Chinese film industry by 1953. So I'm curious, I mean, and it was so funny, albeit scary, how you pointed at one point in the book that for the censors or the officials in China, the 2 hours of film is 2 hours of potential threat, right?
Right.
That's what they are kind of like looking at, always the danger lurking at any corner, which I guess is the case for all authoritarians, because that sort of thing echoed with different countries that come to mind around the world. But I wanted to ask you then, how has that relationship evolved between the state and the art in China, if at all? Because China now has money, as you write, which didn't have before, and the audiences also want to see movies like, other audiences. I mean, how has that evolved? Or also how much choice do actually viewers have? Because you told us about the cinema and the movie theaters, but there is also, if I'm not wrong, a government surveillance and jurisdiction on streaming services. So
Right.
what can the viewers choose, if at all, there?
Well, I mean, this caught Hollywood off guard because
Mm.
I'd say from 2012 or so to 2018,
Mm-hmm.
Hollywood's relationship with China was defined by just the insane amount of money that was being generated there, because there were so many new theaters being built and there was such an appetite for American movies. So movies like the Avengers or Aquaman, like the big superhero spectacles, those often did very well in China, grossing
Mm.
hundreds of millions of dollars. And in some cases, in many cases actually, China would mean the difference between profit and loss on a particular movie. And there was a sense, I think, in a lot of corners of Hollywood, that that would always be the dynamic, that America's cultural dominance,
Mm.
that it is the cultural dominance that America had enjoyed for 100 years would just continue and be extended in China. But then around 2018, something very interesting happened, which is that Chinese movies got better. And a lot of
Mm.
the producers in China absorbed a lot of lessons from watching American movies. And they started to produce a very different kind of film, which was, I guess we could call it the Chinese propaganda blockbuster. Many years ago, if you went to see a Chinese propaganda movie, chances are you were going on a school field trip or you were being sort of forced to against your will because they were so dry and boring. And it was I mean, it just really felt like homework, right? Going to see these movies about the glories of China. And what the Chinese producers more recently have done is they've made movies like some of the listeners may have heard of a film called Wolf Warrior 2,
Mm-hmm.
which was if you read the plot description, it would sound sort of like a Chinese Rambo, like about a Chinese soldier who goes to Africa to save the villagers.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also serves as this great demonstration of Chinese strength and might and international aid on a continent that Chinese leaders care quite a bit about right now. And so you had the sort of, let's call it, the popcorn elements of a movie that could, have the action sequences and the stunts and the romance of traditional entertainment with the messaging of Chinese propaganda. And when
Mm-hmm.
they were able to graph those two on top of one another, it was really quite potent because it served two masters very well. One was the theaters and the economic interests that wanted the box office grosses to keep growing, and the other was the government that wanted the movies to continue to relay a certain kind of message. And so if you follow headlines out of China now, every once in a while you might see a headline pop in Western media about a Chinese movie setting a new record. If you look, chances are it's one of those kinds of movies where you wouldn't call it necessarily state sanctioned propaganda, but it's sort of combining Chinese nationalism with traditional entertainment.
Mm-hmm. And but then it's so interesting to think, and please enlighten us about what do you mean when you say, for example, that what is shown on screens in China is the version that is both kind of through administration approved, it's dictated even before it's produced, it is thought after, it is the version that leaders want to see, as you write in your book. But what is the reality on the ground? Is it different?
Oh, it's a great point. And you mentioned streaming in
Hmm.
your last
Oh
question, and
yeah.
I didn't quite get to that. And for a while, streaming was, I mean, it's as popular in China as it is anywhere else. Um, there have been recent efforts, relatively recent efforts by the government there to place more guardrails on streaming content because they thought that was becoming a little bit too wily for
Hmm.
their comfort level. But your question is a good one, which is, you know, the Chinese moviegoer is as savvy as any moviegoer, um, very aware of government oversight of what they're watching. And so certainly in some cases, let's say Chinese moviegoers follow the rules. In others, it's absolutely the case that piracy allows moviegoers there to see movies that are not approved for release. This is a country where I think the moviegoer tends to be savvier than Hollywood allows allows it to be. And in some cases, I think it's particularly in the bigger cities, the cities with probably more Western access to Western influence, there is certainly more effort to see the films that aren't being allowed in to the country through sanctioned channels. But also, I think at the same time, I said that it had come as a surprise to Hollywood when Chinese movies started doing really well, but it really shouldn't have because I mean, we've seen this in many different corners of Chinese life, but there is a sense across the country that this is a moment for China. That China has in the middle of an ascendancy that has been years in the making. And so the idea that moviegoers there would want to go see films starring their movie stars about their history, their stories, their myths, really shouldn't come as a surprise. And in some ways, um, they may be making up for lost time because there were so many decades there when really the only entertainment, and I'll put that in air quotes,
Hmm.
was really dry, medicinal, even propaganda produced by the state. The market that we're observing now, with its mix of Hollywood movies and Chinese blockbusters,
Hmm.
is really about a decade and a half old.
So how does that then confidence that you talked about translate internationally in the sense I have background in the Balkans. I've known Chinese presence increasing in all aspects of daily life through investments and not just let's say film industry, but different infrastructure projects. So I'm curious, and I appreciated therefore how you address this battle between the U.S. and China playing out in other countries of around the world as well. And you mentioned Africa, but so how successful has China been in um, exporting this vision, I guess? And what's the role of the Belt and Road Initiative specifically within this framework?
Oh, my favorite topic.
Is it?
Yeah, it is. It is. I love this. I love this question.
Awesome.
So because you alluded to what I think a lot of people in Chinese entertainment consider their Achilles heel, which is so the movie I mentioned, Wolf Warrior 2,
Uh-huh.
that made close to $1 billion at the
Hmm.
box office. By all accounts, a massive hit. 98% of those tickets were sold in China. That is
Mm.
very different than an American movie that makes $1 billion. When an American movie makes $1 billion,
Mm.
like a Spider-Man movie or something like that, chances are only about 50%, maybe 45%
Hmm.
of those tickets are sold in the US. The rest are sold around the world. And that's what's given America its soft power
Hmm.
this over the past century. China has not cracked that, and it has failed to sort of produce a global hit. Um, and what we're seeing though is that the Belt and Road Initiative is wittingly providing China with a distribution network to other markets because you mentioned the Balkans. I mean, we could be here all day listening to the number of countries that have some kind of Belt and Road and influence or partnership or cooperation with China. And one thing that I would track whenever I was researching the book was there was this pattern that emerged where every time a country
Hmm.
signed on to a Belt and Road Initiative, not long after a film co-production treaty would be signed, or some movie would go into development in one of the two countries about the partnership or about the history between the two countries. I mean, I remember Sarajevo made a series of movies about Sarajevo's history with China, and
Hmm.
it was kind of in celebration of the new Belt and Road Initiative
Hmm.
work. I mean, it just was pretty clear what was happening here, though, right? Which is that, to your earlier point, like art was reflecting the state, and the Belt and Road Initiative is a massive priority. And within the Belt and Road Initiative, there's what they call the people to people connection, which
Hmm.
is trying to find those cultural ties. Now, it's a little ham-handed, as you can imagine, and there's not necessarily maybe a market for a big movie about Sarajevo's history with China, but it serves several purposes, right?
Hmm.
And I think one thing that is so fascinating, and this is the last chapter of my book, is that in Africa in particular, there's been a
Right.
real effort to export Chinese movies and TV shows to the country. And the main sort of conduit of that is this initiative called the 10,000 Villages Project, which is distributing low cost satellite dishes to African villages that are produced by a Chinese firm called Star Times. And if you drive through these villages, I went to Kenya, but if you drive through villages in various countries, you'll see these bright orange satellite dishes on top of these these homes or apartments. And the satellite dishes are piping in Chinese TV shows, Chinese movies, other channels too, Kenyan entertainment, American entertainment, Spanish entertainment, but also Chinese entertainment. And it's serving as this kind of cultural introduction into the country that is really, building railroads or building expressways or having all this other kind of hard influence, let's call it.
You're right in your book, and that's kind of that combination that is not just what Chinese leaders are doing in terms of, but they a lot of other authoritarians are embracing, and that is precisely that. You're right, combination of authoritarian measures and market economics that offer the combo of shopping malls and a surveillance state, as you're right, which is I think so correct. Again, in so many different cases, and just in case we were not clear for the audience, the Belt and Road Initiative, for those who might not know, is a series of Chinese loans and infrastructure investment that kind of connect China now to more than 65 countries, I believe, right? And population of 4.4 billion. But the catch 22 is that unfortunately the borrowers often cannot return the money back. So it's a kind of it's a very smart move from China, but it tells us a little bit, and I'll ask you about it, both about, well, the vacuum that they're filling, I guess, obviously, and how how the United States or Americans, not just Hollywood, how did it allow, or how do they, the hubris, I guess, because you said it shouldn't have surprised Hollywood officials. So, I mean, there seems to be no easy solution in this situation. And throughout the book, that relationship is described, as you've said, both as sort of courtship, sometimes foxy blackmail, and really weird, but also expected power games between US and China. And for me personally, it was so fascinating to read because one doesn't think about it, doesn't know what happens behind the screen in terms of the instance that you mentioned, how in November 99, the US and China reached an agreement that allowed China's entry into WTO in 2001. And like, I mean, or what did they get? Like how Hollywood got an entry to, China to double in terms of the films. And then afterwards, in 2012, I believe, how US got 34 movies in a year with 25% back to studios. And it was just fascinating to be like, wow, this is the sort of transactions that is being negotiated at the highest level. So, I mean, you clearly acknowledge a fear of crossing China. And we see it every day in I mean, so many issues. So my question also as we approach the end of the conversation is to ask each one of my guests, tell me about the wider angle of this
Mm.
fascinating, albeit a bit scary story. I mean, like you clearly both criticize Hollywood, how they were like too cozy. I mean, they had very warm relations with the regime, as you say, but then it kept emboldening, encouraging China. And then you point how the lack of outcry to China in different instances in the US over the treatment, whether it's Hong Kong, some particular Chinese actors, carried consequences, political consequences of those choices. So, what do you think? Actually, what are you warning the public about regarding, but also beyond Hollywood?
Yeah, I think the wider angle here was always top of mind. I mean, I think the movies
Hmm.
are important and culture is important, but one thing that I was really drawn to in writing this book was
Hmm.
how Hollywood was in many ways a really early student to a lot of the dynamics you just described.
Hmm.
You're right. Every day we see a story of an airline or a hotel chain or a tech company or a car company doing something to make sure that they can maintain warm relations with the regime or access to their consumers, right?
Hmm.
And a lot of the lessons that those industries are learning were absorbed by Hollywood 20 years ago. And it is, placating the regime in exchange for market access, knowing what topics to avoid, whether it's Taiwan or Tibet, or more recently, the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and just doing whatever you can to make sure that you never jeopardize what shareholders come to expect is a massive revenue stream, right? And so I look at what's happening with so many firms right now, whether it's Apple or Nike or the National Basketball Association,
Hmm.
and I see lessons that Hollywood had to learn many years ago. I mean, I think, like for instance, I open my book with the story of Kundun, a movie about the Dalai Lama that kind of came and went in 1997. It was directed by Martin Scorsese, and it was released by Disney. And this was in 1997, so the Chinese market was infinitesimal compared to what it is now. And nonetheless, whenever the movie was being produced, Disney was warned that if they proceeded with the making of this film, this sort of on-screen valorization of what China considers a state enemy, they would see it as an interference in China's internal affairs, and that Disney's business in China would stop overnight. And that's what happened. When the movie came out, Disney was kicked out of the country. And it wasn't until the CEO at the time went over and apologized, frankly, groveled to Communist Party officials that they were allowed back in. Now, flash forward to today, and Disney has a $5.5 billion theme park outside of Shanghai. What will Disney do to make sure that they can protect that holding and not do anything to jeopardize it, right? You start to see how where the leverage very quickly goes. And I think this wider angle points to the last question you asked about the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China's model, the shopping mall surveillance state model, is being offered up to other countries around the world at a time when American influence and, let's say, America's reputation is faltering. And so this question of who will be the superpower of the 21st century is one that is playing out not just at a governance level and a political influence level, but I would argue it's already played out for years in the business space. And the movies are this very unlikely yet powerful case study in that.
Of course, it's an ongoing struggle or a battle. And you end the book like that, saying it remains to be seen kind of what will happen. So I'm just wondering, and you mentioned Disney. It was fascinating. And by the way, I just didn't want to mention all other movies that we know, many of us know as viewers, because I want people to read your book. But it's fascinating to read about, 7 Years of Tibet and all the controversies about so many blockbusters. And you're like, wow, that's what happened. Oh, I never knew that. Oh, how could I have known? But it's really fascinating. So I hope the audience delves more into your book. But having all that in mind, what we have also seen, and just kind of maybe our last comment is a reaction, though, against these, let's say, human rights abuses, for example, in China, and you acknowledge that in terms of post-Trump's era, how Americans, or some Americans also, are, raising their voice about these choices that American businesses are making. And Mulan is one stunning example of that. Even how it was, quote unquote, discovered, in terms of, I mean, maybe you can tell us just shortly about it. But so my question is, where do you think this is going to go? I mean, it's so difficult considering so much investment, as you mentioned, the theme parks of all businesses. What do you think? Where is this going?
Well, I think, it's interesting. The Mulan example that you gave is a good one. This was in 2020,
Mm-hmm.
shortly before actually COVID shut down the world. Disney released a live action remake of the cartoon Mulan, which is
Mm-hmm.
obviously based on a Chinese myth. And it was assumed that this would be a massive hit in China. It flopped for a number of reasons, one of which was there was an eagle-eyed viewer who noticed that the movie in the closing credits thanked authorities in Xinjiang,
Xinjiang.
where the Uyghurs have been held, and basically the movie had filmed in the province, and then, as I said, taken this extra step of sort of thanking the local authorities, and in some cases the local security forces, for their aid in making the film. And what was interesting about that moment was that it drew outcry from Democrats and Republicans. And until then, and for much of the time that I was writing the book, I would say criticism of China and the CCP was a largely Republican
Mm-hmm.
issue, and I think that that was probably due to a number of, or there were a number of reasons for that. One was that Donald Trump was making it a cause of his, and I think that Democrats who might have been sympathetic to that criticism were reluctant to give Trump any oxygen, or sort of give him any leeway. I would talk to folks here in Hollywood who were very liberal or progressive, and they would say, um, I hate Trump, but he's right about China. They wouldn't say that sort of too loudly, but they would admit that they agreed with him on that. And then I think when Trump left office, the temperature went down a little bit, and now we see that Democrats and Republicans, often for somewhat different reasons. Maybe there's more of a free speech, human rights angle on one side. Maybe there's more of a fear of um, communism spread on the other. Um, Nonetheless, are finding some kind of common ground in criticizing China. It really has emerged as one of the few topics
Mm-hmm.
that Democrats and Republicans seem to agree on. And it seems like, in particular, there is a real knee-jerk reaction to businesses placating the CCP. That is something that it seems like Democrats and Republicans really don't want American businesses to stand for. And it raises the question of why the movies seem to resonate, like why changing movies seems to resonate in ways that others don't. And I think it's because, you know, for 100 years, we've expected Hollywood, we being Americans, have expected Hollywood to do America's bidding, sometimes overtly and sometimes more covertly, but we've expected American movies to be American products that put our best face forward and control the emotions, really, orchestrate the emotions of moviegoers around the world. And so to see that altered and manipulated by a foreign power, I think it hits differently and more emotionally than, if a semiconductor firm or an electric vehicle firm is making changes to placate the regime. I think that this sort of speaks to the power of culture, and particularly the power of the American movie that had created the American century.
And it's a really outstanding book. It's really fascinating topic. I think this idea, or the conversations about kind of the global order, I guess, much wider than just the film industry, is an ongoing one with everything that's been going on in the world. We It's a completely different topic, but with everything that's been going on in Ukraine with Vladimir Putin,
Mhm.
etc. So there are a lot of challenges. But as you said, films and movies are one vehicle, but super powerful tools for just this global supremacy, cultural supremacy. One very aspect of that fight between different countries. Eric, thank you so much for being with us today.
Oh, it's been my pleasure. Thank you.
And for all of you, stay tuned for more conversations with people from all over the globe. Have a good day. Bye.